Welcome to this explainer. Today we're doing something a bit different. We're going to conduct a cold, philosophical postmortem on a soul that literally committed existential suicide. How? By choosing safety over life. We're going to analyze this dark, Gothic fable through the lens of existentialist and Nietzschean philosophy. We'll look at the very philology of his failure, how he twisted words like mastery to essentially build his own spiritual tomb. So let's dive into this terrifying tension between essence and existence.
There are those who build cathedrals to hold the living God, and those who build glass cases to hold the memory of him. The second sort call their cases wisdom, and wonder why the God inside no longer breathes. We're starting with this chilling little observation straight from the margins of a dark codex, because it perfectly sets up the tragedy we're looking at. It's the stark difference between a lived life and a hoarded memory. On one side, you have the cathedral, this massive, open space for the chaotic, living divine. On the other, a sealed glass case for a dead memory. And the real tragedy here is that the builders of these cases mistake their hoarding for wisdom. They have absolutely no idea that they've suffocated the very life they were trying to protect.
All right, Chapter 1, The Illusion of Mastery. Let's set the scene and observe a changeless city, and one man who completely mastered the art of not living. Imagine living the exact same day, over and over again. The source text uses this super disturbing metaphor of a bug collector to describe his routine. His days were arranged like specimens pinned to felt, pressed perfectly flat, meticulously categorized and completely sealed away from what it calls the corrupting air of surprise. He actually called this rigid, lifeless routine mastery. He genuinely thought these sterile days were a perfected state of being, totally safe from the chaotic terror of actually living.
But here's the catch. While he was sitting there, fully believing the static existence gave him divine control and an impenetrable shield against pain, the reality was a massive failure. The vast, indifferent city outside his window, it didn't even notice him. His so-called perfect control just made him invisible. And the source identifies this extreme isolation as a deep, unacknowledged wound, one he absolutely refused to name, because if he said it out loud, he'd have to admit his mastery was a complete illusion.
Moving into Chapter 2. The reversal of essence. Now we need to look at exactly how he tried to bend the cosmic laws of existence to his will and why it totally doomed him.
So the core of this whole fable revolves around an existentialist reversal. Now, the fundamental cosmic rule is that existence precedes essence, meaning you exist first, you make choices, and through all that messy, chaotic process, you forge your definition. But this guy, he attempted a fatal reversal. He wanted essence without existence. He essentially wanted to be a god of definition who had completely finalized his identity, just totally bypassing the radical freedom and the terrifying responsibility of ever having to make a real choice again.
To pull off this reversal, he turns his room into a museum he calls his intellectual salvage. Even the philology of that phrase is a lie, right? I mean, you salvage wreckage, not a living thing. Along his walls, he hung these extracted moments from his past. A laugh, a moment of fear, the morning light, all dried out like flowers pressed in a book. He profoundly confused a museum for a home. He really believed that if he could just possess a moment under glass, it would never shift and it could never cause him pain.
And this perfectly illustrates the core philosophical conflict of our dark fable. You have essence, which is static, finished, and safe. And then you have existence, which is this constant state of becoming. It's deeply chaotic and is defined by radical freedom. Our architect of stagnation desperately wanted to freeze his past into static objects, but by hoarding this artificial essence, he was fundamentally rejecting the terrifying, fiery necessity of authentic existence.
If we map out the trajectory of his life, it really reveals the horror of his choice. This isn't a journey of growth or evolution. It's literally a flat line. Year 1, year 30, year 50, they are the exact same identical day. It's a lifeless, sterile parody of eternity. What he proudly called a perfected trajectory was actually just a lifelong, cowardly submission to the void. He reduced his entire timeline to an empty horizon.
Chapter 3. The reality of spiritual entropy. Because, as it turns out, the universe is entirely indifferent to our hoarding, and any closed system is inevitably going to fail.
So we arrive at the Socratic interrogation of his life's work. Why does the God inside no longer breathe? What actually happens when you confuse the stillness of a finished thing with the wisdom of a lived life? Well, if you trap a living spirit inside a perfectly sealed, unchanging glass case, the answer is pretty inevitable. Eventually, the air runs out.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of this spiritual rot.
First, he tried to hoard the infinite, chaotic nature of lived moments inside finite, static boundaries. Second, by sealing them all away, he starved his memories of the oxygen they desperately needed, that corrupting air of surprise. And because of that, the brilliant, vibrant stars of his youth inevitably fell to spiritual entropy. They literally crumbled into lifeless gray powder right behind the glass.
It took him an entire lifetime to discover this catastrophic error. As his room started to smell of dust, that decay proved definitively that his impenetrable glass cases were never actually protecting his life. They were suffocating it. He hadn't preserved his essence at all. He had meticulously and cowardly asphyxiated it. Chapter 4. The Self-Made Tomb. We've reached the bitter autopsy of his spiritual failure. When his illusions finally shatter, we get this incredibly stark contrast between his perceived state and the actual reality. He viewed himself as the absolute master of his world, right? But reality judged him as merely the guardian of his own stagnation. He believed he'd achieved this perfected state of being, but the truth was just a lifeless, sterile void. This grand sanctuary of wisdom he thought he built was, in reality, just a self-made tomb.
His so-called mastery was nothing but a philosophical fraud. The text calls it the lead of mortality. This wasn't enlightenment, it was a symptom of profound existential cowardice. He used this heavy, static routine as a tool to completely escape the terrifying burden of radical freedom. By actively choosing to stop making choices, he cowardly rejected the fundamental responsibility of being human.
The dark, undeniable lesson of this fable is this. Authentic existence demands that meaning cannot be possessed. You absolutely cannot pin it to felt, and you can't put it under glass. Meaning is an action. It's not an object. It has to be continuously, painfully forged by actually participating in the chaos of life, right up until the void inevitably reclaims us.
And to undo this kind of spiritual rot, passive realization is completely useless. The text demands a violent reclamation of life. You have to shatter the glass of that perfect, sterile order. You have to sweep away the gray powder of those hoarded pasts and perform a vital, chaotic grave dance over your own illusions. It requires a necessary destruction of the false self just to let authentic existence breathe again.
As we wrap up this explainer, we turn the cold lens of this Gothic fable back onto ourselves. It forces us to take a hard look at our own desire for safety over living. So I'll leave you with this. Are you engaging in the terrifying, ongoing, chaotic act of becoming? Or, out of existential cowardice, are you simply building your own glass cases, just waiting to become dust?